Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Kirby Institute seminar series. My name is Bridget Hare. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So today we're presenting from the Bidjigal country. And I extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here today, both in the audience and online. I've got a couple of logistics points to make before we start off. The format of this seminar is we're going to start off with 3 presentations, followed by a Q&A at the end of all of the presentations. But you can ask questions throughout by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So we'll start the Q&A session at the end of all presentations, but feel free to put your presentations in as we go. It's now my very, very great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nathanael Wells. He is a medical anthropologist and social scientist at the Kirby Institute, UNSW. Nathanael's current work explores the experiences of people recently diagnosed with HIV, HIV peer support services, and the sexual health of migrant, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks for that introduction. Now, Associate Professor Bridget Hare, congratulations on the recent promotion. Thanks also to the Kirby Seminar Committee for the opportunity to speak today, and also to Jane and Bo Justin for agreeing to share some of their time and reflections and be part of today's presentation. So as Bridget said, my name's Nathanael Wells and I'm a research associate here at the Kirby Institute. And in today's talk, I'm going to present some findings from the Global Undetectable Untransmittable Roundtable that was held alongside the International AIDS Society conference that was in Brisbane in 2023. And this roundtable brought together international experts to discuss key priorities for the promotion of research related to and policy making about undetectable equals untransmittable. So just before I start to disclose that the roundtable was funded by ViiV Healthcare and they had no input into the contents of this presentation or the report that this presentation draws from. So I first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. I'm currently on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And in the context of this presentation, I also recognise the ongoing processes of colonisation that continue to shape disparities in HIV health outcomes today, access to treatment and the benefits of reaching an undetectable viral load. And that also includes knowledge dissemination around messaging about undetectable viral load and undetectable equals untransmittable. I recognise also that these processes are ongoing and continue to occur both in Australia and globally. So now widespread scientific consensus that by reducing an individual's HIV viral load to undetectable levels, HIV treatment can eliminate the risk of HIV transmission, and that an undetectable viral load eliminates the risk of HIV transmission has been repeatedly proven in large-scale clinical trials. So, for example, the Partner 1 and 2 studies, as well as the Opposites Attract study, followed couples where one partner was HIV negative and the other was HIV positive, with the partner living with HIV having a sustained undetectable viral load. And collectively, these trials recorded approximately 147,000 instances of condomless sex, not protected by PrEP, and where the viral load of the partner living with HIV was undetectable, no HIV transmissions occurred. And the scientific consensus that an undetectable viral load eliminates the risk of HIV transmission underpins the global undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U movement. Launched in 2016 by Prevention Access Campaign, which is a non-profit and grassroots HIV organisation, the U equals U campaign aims to raise awareness about the benefits of an undetectable viral load, both for the health and wellbeing of people living with HIV themselves, and also in reducing rates of HIV transmission. And the U equals U campaign aims to empower people living with HIV to live full social, sexual and reproductive lives, dismantle HIV stigma, promote a public health argument for increased treatment access, and provide scientific evidence to advocate that national and international health organisations update HIV guidelines for the treatment and management of HIV. And from its inception in 2016, U equals U has been a grassroots community-led movement and is now endorsed by over 1,050 organisations in approximately 105 countries worldwide. In 2023, actually at the International AIDS Society conference, the World Health Organization launched a policy brief on the benefits of viral suppression for improving the health and well-being of people living with HIV and in reducing rates of HIV transmission. And in this brief, the World Health Organization explicitly state that, and to quote, people living with HIV who have an undetectable viral load have zero risk of transmitting to their partner. And I just wanted to emphasize the word zero here, as saying zero risk within health and medical circles is something that health professionals are potentially sometimes reluctant to do. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. So, despite the scientific evidence underpinning U equals U and the proven physical and mental health benefits that an undetectable viral load can have for people living with HIV, awareness of and trust in U equals U is not universal. And key priorities for improving community-centred, evidence-informed U equals U policy and research were the focus of a half-day global roundtable in 2023, held alongside the 12th International AIDS Society Conference on HIV Science in Brisbane, Australia. And this roundtable formed part of a series of U equals U roundtables held, one of which was held at the 2022 International AIDS Conference in Montreal, and more recently, the International AIDS Conference in Munich earlier this year. And this presentation builds on the 2023 roundtable and a recent publication that reported on these proceedings. Just in terms of the format, so approximately 55 delegates attended, and these included representatives from community-based HIV organisations, healthcare professionals, researchers, policymakers, people living with HIV, and international and Australian NGOs. And after a series of presentations, delegates participated in small group discussions about issues relating to advancing U equals U policy, research, and promotion. And the key aim of these discussions was to identify and explore gaps in U equals U research and implementation, contribute to the development of best practice policies, and identify global priorities to ensure everyone affected by HIV can benefit from U equals U messaging. Roundtable discussions were led by 5 facilitators and 5 note takers who worked through successive groups guiding conversations, and detailed notes were then collated and analysed, drawing on thematic analysis techniques. So delegates identified that adopting the language of zero risk, as reflected in the WHO policy brief, was crucial when describing U equals U as an effective HIV prevention strategy. Alongside HIV pre and post-exposure prophylaxis, U equals U is part of a broader biomedical shift in approaches to preventing HIV transmission. And the knowledge of the preventive benefits of antiretroviral therapies isn't necessarily new. So in 2008, for example, the Swiss National AIDS Commission issued the so-called Swiss Statement, where it was stated that a person living with HIV who was on effective treatment and had a sustained undetectable viral load could not transmit HIV. The emergence of pre-exposure prophylaxis and U equals U, also known as treatment as prevention, have challenged traditional HIV prevention strategies that centred around condom use. And delegates argued that as a result, some clinicians may be hesitant to communicate U equals U as completely removing any potential risk of HIV transmission. And additionally, health professionals are sometimes reluctant to promote anything as either 100% effective or 100% risk-free. However, the use of language such as negligible or almost zero carries with it the implication that although remote, an undetectable viral load does not guarantee 100% that the risk of HIV transmission is zero. There's a small but remote chance. So adopting the language of zero risk has the potential to remove any ambiguity about the effectiveness of an undetectable viral load in preventing HIV. Delegates also identified a need for healthcare professionals to actually communicate the message that an undetectable viral load eliminates the possibility of HIV transmission. Alongside HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis, U equals U is a relatively new concept that has challenged existing ways of thinking about HIV prevention. And as a result, some clinicians may be hesitant to trust that an undetectable viral load prevents HIV transmission. In a recent survey of Australian physicians, for example, it was found that while almost 3/4 of respondents believed an undetectable viral load to be effective, approximately 1/4 were either neutral or disagreed. And in that same study, it was found that only 1/3 of participants had actually discussed the benefits of an undetectable viral load with their clients. Delegates identified a need then that healthcare workers must also be encouraged to proactively inform their clients about the health and protective benefits of an undetectable viral load. While awareness of U equals U is increasing, in-depth knowledge and trust remains limited and uneven, and largely concentrated among those who are already engaged with gay, bisexual, and queer communities. And even among these populations, awareness and trust in U equals U as an HIV prevention strategy is most concentrated among people living with HIV. And delegates argued that among other populations affected by HIV, knowledge of and trust in U equals U was more limited. And delegates commonly identified a need for members of all affected communities, including women, Indigenous and First Nations people, trans folk, racially minoritized groups, migrants, people who use drugs, and sex workers, just to name a few, to be explicitly included in policies that utilise and promote U equals U. And there was widespread agreement of a need to ensure that U equals U messaging remains relevant, useful, and utilised in the global HIV response, and particularly for those underrepresented populations and groups such as those I just mentioned. U equals U can be a powerful message. However, U equals U or undetectable equals untransmittable may not necessarily be understood by all populations affected by HIV. It was therefore noted that researchers, policymakers, and healthcare professionals must work closely with community-based organisations to tailor messaging that is culturally appropriate. I think many of us will recognise that that's also pretty much underpinned the Australian response to HIV's working with affected communities. So providing that messaging makes it clear that there is zero risk of HIV transmission, language may not necessarily need to explicitly state U equals U or undetectable equals untransmittable. And just to go off on a quick tangent, as I was putting this presentation together, I was reminded of a discussion that occurred in a focus group that I was co-facilitating for another project. And this project explores the healthcare needs of overseas-born gay, bisexual men living with HIV, which I've had the great pleasure of working with Bo Justin on. And undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U, formed part of that focus group discussion. And some participants indicated that what that message meant wasn't always clear, particularly as the language was sometimes felt to be overly technical and in some cases not conveyed to them in a way that they understood. And so one of the moderators posed the question to the group and said, to quote, "How can we better explain the message that you can't pass it on?" And in quick response, one participant replied and said, "Well, you've just said it, you can't pass it on." So, I just thought that it reminded me that while U equals U is a powerful message, I think this example highlights the need to work really closely with affected communities, and in this instance, overseas-born gay and bisexual men living with HIV, to ensure that language is relevant, that it resonates, and it's culturally appropriate. So, ensuring all people living with HIV have access to appropriate healthcare and treatment is crucial to ensuring the health and wellbeing of people living with HIV. However, as I'm sure will be familiar with many people on this webinar, HIV remains a highly stigmatised health condition, both here in Australia and globally. And in some contexts, appeals to invest in treatment access that centre the health and wellbeing of people living with HIV might not be enough, particularly given its association with already marginalised population groups, some of whom are denied legal protection in many areas. So migrants, people who use drugs, sex workers, gay and bisexual men. Some delegates suggested that in some contexts, appeals to improve treatment access that emphasise the economic and public health benefits may be more successful. So that is highlighting how increasing undetectable viral load at a community level might reduce rates of HIV transmission, which in turn may improve resource capacity of health systems in the long term. So essentially drawing on U equals U to make an economic argument for investing in HIV health services. And I'm very conscious that centring the economic and public health benefits for improving treatment access could run the very real risk that it characterises or portrays people living with HIV as a group that need to be monitored and controlled by public health and legal authorities. And so care does need to be taken so that emphasising the economic and public health benefits goes alongside efforts to also reduce HIV-related stigma and improve the quality of life of all people living with HIV. Some delegates also identified a need that political endorsement of U equals U shouldn't be siloed within health departments, and importantly, that its endorsement of U equals U is not undermined by other government policies. So one example put forward of where the messaging and science behind U equals U is potentially being undermined this is within an otherwise supportive government HIV response, is the New South Wales Mandatory Testing Act of 2021. And the science behind U equals U has been endorsed in both federal and state-based HIV strategies, including in the New South Wales HIV strategy. However, the Mandatory Testing Act gives police and other public service workers the power to force people to undergo a test for HIV and other bloodborne viruses when, through the deliberate action of a third party, a public service worker is exposed to bodily fluids, which includes saliva. Such policies not only ignore that there is no risk of HIV transmission through being exposed to saliva, they also directly contradict any endorsement of U equals U that's made by government health departments. And I would argue that they also reflect a quite outdated understanding of HIV and HIV transmission. So at an individual level, an undetectable viral load can have significant benefits for the mental and physical well-being of people living with HIV, and can engender a sense of optimism about living with HIV long-term and reduce anxieties about onward sexual transmission, which are very real anxieties for many people living with HIV. By eliminating the risk of HIV transmission, knowledge of U equals U has the potential of reducing HIV-related stigma at both an individual and community level. Indeed, U equals U has been promoted as a powerful tool for tackling HIV-related stigma among the broader population. And in this slide, I've deliberately included a question mark in the heading, as some delegates stated that and argued that it's necessary to keep in mind that in the focus of undetectable equals untransmittable messaging, it's around the elimination of HIV transmission. And some delegates noted that HIV-related stigma is not only grounded in fear of acquiring the virus. Rather, HIV-related stigma is underpinned by its association with behaviours and populations considered by some as socially transgressive and even some would argue, except I wouldn't, but some would argue immoral. So while an undetectable viral load eliminates the potential of HIV transmission, it's also necessary to remember that it's not a cure. And many people living with HIV will continue to contend with discrimination and stigma associated with those already marginalised populations that are most affected by HIV, often regardless of whether they're part of those populations or not. It was also identified about the potential for the formation of a new serodivide. And here by serodivide, I'm referring to a divide between people living with HIV and those not living with HIV, where those that are living with HIV are rejected sexually and socially. So Australian and international guidelines recommend that people start HIV treatment as soon as possible after receiving an HIV diagnosis. And for many, rapid treatment initiation is desired, potentially unproblematic, and an important aspect of regaining a sense of control over their health and well-being. However, beginning antiretroviral therapy is not always straightforward, and some individuals may decide to delay or even refuse treatment owing to factors such as concerns about side effects, the risk of unintended disclosure should someone happen to see the treatment, anticipated and internalised HIV-related stigma, cultural attitudes and beliefs about medication, as well as barriers to accessing ongoing HIV treatment and care. And some delegates raise concerns that U equals U and the push to increase the numbers of people on treatment may lead to a further serodivide. And that is, on the one hand, there are those for whom treatment is successful and who are able to reach an undetectable viral load, and so as a result no longer seen as a so-called threat to public health. But on the other hand, there are also a small number who either choose not to take treatment, don't manage to reach an undetectable viral load, or even those for whom treatment has failed. And there's a risk that they become characterised as a threat to public health and justifying heightened medical and legal surveillance. So I feel like there's been quite a bit of information thrown out there. So just sort of by way of concluding, I'll sort of just briefly summarise everything. So firstly, essential that when describing an undetectable viral load as an effective HIV prevention strategy, that the language of zero risk is used. Words such as negligible or almost zero imply that there's a possibility, albeit remote, for HIV transmission when an individual has an undetectable viral load. And this implication has the potential to undermine the science behind U equals U out in the broader community. But I would argue that more importantly, it could also cause anxiety among some people living with HIV, that they might potentially be that remote possibility, that sort of one in a million that led to their partner acquiring HIV. As mentioned, awareness of and trust in U equals U remains uneven and largely concentrated among people living with HIV who are connected to LGBTQ+ communities. And to improve awareness of and trust in U equals U beyond people living with HIV, there's a need for coordinated and collaborative action across stakeholders. And that must include people living with HIV, key and priority populations, international and community-based health organisations, local governments and policymakers, researchers, clinicians, and HIV advocates. And the science underpinning U equals U can also be used to make a public health case for expanding treatment access. However, I recognise that there's a real tension that it might also justify increased medical and legal surveillance of people living with HIV. And so I think any public health argument also needs to be accompanied by efforts to reduce HIV-related stigma and discrimination. And it was identified for a real need to reduce and eliminate policies that contradict the science that underpins U equals U. And I mentioned previously the New South Wales Mandatory Testing Act, but we could also here be thinking about migration policies that discriminate against people living with HIV, including policies like that here in Australia. And there's also an urgent need to address structural barriers to HIV care, including policies that not only seek to improve treatment availability, but that also work to reduce poverty and eliminate discrimination and stigma. And without prioritising the holistic medical and social needs of those who are most vulnerable and most marginalised, without centring the needs of people living with HIV at the heart of the response, and without supporting community-led monitoring to track and evaluate U equals U policy, uptake and implementation, the full benefits of U equals U will ultimately remain unrealised by all stakeholders in the global HIV response. So I'll stop there, but before I finish, I just want to again thank Bridget for chairing today, and Jane and Bo Justin for what I anticipate will be some incredibly insightful reflections. And I also want to recognise the co-authors of the report that this presentation drew on, particularly Brent Allen, and on behalf of them extend that gratitude to all delegates who shared their knowledge during the roundtable, and also just finally to acknowledge the role of all roundtable participants living with HIV, many of whom shared their own experiences and perspectives to move these conversations forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. That was a very insightful and thoughtful presentation. I particularly like the point that you made actually in your acknowledgement of country about your awareness of the inequities, the health inequities that can so contribute to the inadequate access that certain populations can have to something like U equals U. But it's my very great pleasure to now, actually just before I introduce our next speaker, let me remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A and we will be getting to you at the end of the third presentation. But I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, who I think will be well known to most people here today and who are online. This is Jane Costello. So Jane is, of course, the CEO of Positive Life, New South Wales. And in a previous life, she was the Research and Program Manager at the Kirby Institute at UNSW, Sydney. And Jane works across sexual health, surveillance, evaluation and research. And her research intersects human rights, social justice and policy. Thank you, Jane, for joining us here today.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Nathan, for inviting me. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, which are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to acknowledge anybody living with HIV who is online today. So when Nathan pitched this to me, he said he wanted me to talk to how messaging promotion of undetectable viral load is received among the communities we work with, what I see as some important priorities, and whether U equals U has lived up to its promise of eliminating stigma. So I'm going to sort of frame my discussion loosely around that and more broadly around the key themes that came out of the report that Nathan has just mentioned. So clearly, the science that's currently available strongly supports U equals U, and that's a reason to make sure that all people living with HIV or vulnerable to acquiring HIV have access to this information so that they can make the most informed decisions possible about their own sexual healths and lives. And we know that HIV stigma is the biggest barrier to ending the HIV epidemic. So it's really important to break down that stigma wherever possible by providing access to information, community support, peer support, and advocacy. And that's where I think this U equals U messaging can come in quite strongly. So it has the potential to address all kinds of HIV stigma, including institutional stigma that occurs in healthcare settings, workplaces, and more broadly across society, perhaps. Interpersonal between people, the stigma that can be so damaging amongst sort of family, friends, and networks, and internalized or perceived stigma, which are those negative beliefs about HIV, which are held by those of us living with HIV ourselves. And I think we need to be empowered by U equals U for the science and for the fact that HIV treatment over the past 30 years has advanced us to a place where people living with HIV no longer can transmit the virus, and it really helps us to sustain a higher quality of life. As people living with HIV, we've known around about treatment as prevention for a long time, and obviously the science was absolutely solidified with U equals U. But I think we need to be really clear that U equals U isn't a viable option for everybody. And there are barriers to why some people can't achieve it. And our goal is not just an endpoint that's only some of us have been able to achieve. It should be a tool of encouragement for those who are afraid or frightened to get tested, those lost to care and follow-up. And we need to ensure that it doesn't actually create or cause more stigma and separation. So I think one of the points that we need to make is that this is essentially something that was very much started as a movement amongst white middle-class gay men. And it's a bit of a top-down movement in that respect. But I think it's really around ensuring that we get in the best position to ensure that people can become undetectable. But we don't want to marginalize people who tend to be left out with that promise of you will come back for you later. So we need to ensure that nobody is left behind. And I think if we don't get to that point when overall health, which should be our main goal, is somehow subsumed into the U equals U messaging, that may be problematic for those who are more marginalized, but it also has a sense of creating, which I'm going to talk to, a new zero divide, which was one of the themes that came out of the discussion. So the first theme that was in the discussion paper was a need for targeted, tailored messaging, and also a need for unqualified messaging. And I think while the report gave the example of the Vietnamese campaign to promote U equals U by translating it into K equals K, and it's been done in other languages and other Asian countries, it's still not fully translatable for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, women or heterosexual communities for whom messaging, and Nathan also gave this as an example from the workshop that he did with Bo Justin, can't pass it on, is probably more appropriate and more understandable. And I think there's also hesitancy, and Nathan did touch on this as well, some healthcare providers accepting that U equals U is quite a difficult message to convey. They don't always have the time to convey that. But we also need to understand it was shaped by a legacy of HIV risk messages and persistent HIV stigma that has happened over the years. And that I think we need to be cautious of the unintended harms and stigma that may come from sort of an uncritical celebration and promotion of the U equals U message. And I think one of the drawbacks of the rise of U equals U is that in a sense, it's creating an absolute consensus, an almost singular discursive message, and it can really obscure the nuanced way not only service providers have to respond to each particular individual's unique needs and concerns, but those of the people living with HIV and what they need to know around their good health and optimal well-being. I think we need to evaluate health promotion material on undetectability, and we also need to look at health promotion and or debriefing opportunities with healthcare providers to really understand some of the challenges they may be encountering in relaying new HIV information, particularly at that point of diagnosis, and to share some of those successful strategies used to communicate U=U and the advances in biomedical HIV prevention more broadly with different communities. So despite this reliance on evidence-based messaging being the standard of care and practice, we know that such evidence really needs to respond to the individuals living with HIV needs, and we must make nuanced decisions about how we translate the significance of treatment as prevention. And I think we can't let U=U in the sense of it being a very popular or rhetorical framework overshadow the context-specific work and the need to support organisations and groups who are working on finding that appropriate balance, but may be reluctant to speak up about their challenges for fear of being perceived as unaccepting of U=U and thus reproducing HIV stigma. And we need to acknowledge the complexity of this shift in orthodoxy in HIV prevention and the other opportunities to navigate the health communication complexity and ethics so that people are best equipped to translate evidence-based messaging in the most impactful way. As I said to you before, it's sometimes not possible in a 15-minute appointment slot to fit U=U into what is often a whole lot of other priorities. And we often hear people talk about client-centered care and providing that, but it's not always possible to do and have conversations around that, particularly if you think about early treatment as prevention discussions for people living with HIV who may not be ready to start medication or be not very comfortable with U=U messaging. And that again points to a really tailored approach to discussing U=U with people living with HIV. We need to think more broadly about additional resources that really might help healthcare providers think about when and how to talk about U=U in the context of client or patient-centered care, and really including when those in-depth conversations might need to be delayed. So I've said there's a need for more culturally appropriate resources, including materials for populations other than gay and bisexual men and for non-English speaking people living with HIV. And I think U=U as a framework really has to be more than just proving that the bodies of people living with HIV are safe to have sex with. And it is very much, when we talk about the stigma, we're talking about the stigma of sexual transmission. And I think this needs to be sort of acknowledged. So in terms of a new serodivide, which was the third theme in the report, there is U=U framings do echo warnings of this creation of an undetectable divide between groups and what's been sometimes referred to as a stigmatized viral underclass. Around 5% of people living with HIV can't suppress their HIV viral load to undetectable levels. And the reasons for this are myriad, but they include genetics, treatment-resistant factors, immunocompromised systems, or various multi-morbidity health conditions. And there may be times sort of during our lives where we can't maintain viral suppression for a range of different reasons. So for women, often it's because they have a harder time getting their viral loads to undetectable because they're more likely to be diagnosed later in life, have late diagnoses. They often prioritize the health of others over their own. And then we need to talk about the inequity for women, particularly around higher rates of violence, poverty, and instability that comes with those social determinants of health, which really can make it sometimes hard to be consistent with medication. And it's true that being undetectable is what is recommended, but it doesn't necessarily equal healthy, nor is it a status that once attained is always manageable. And there's things like religious beliefs, other inabilities to use treatment, barriers to care, or personal choice. We know that people will not always be detectable and they should be protected and not othered. And we should always take an approach to those living with HIV that centres the totality of their health and not their status. So I think the limits of the HIV prevention message, we really need to note that viral load does not equate value. And there are legitimate concerns that U=U messaging does place an inordinate focus, particularly globally, on people living with HIV who don't have equitable access to HIV medication and to quality rights-based health care. And we need to have that collective celebration of U equals U will be undermined if we don't have that access to testing, treatment, care and support, and viral suppression for everyone. And I just want to expand just briefly on this issue of choice and autonomy. And I think while we'd all agree that the outcomes are better the sooner someone goes on treatment after being diagnosed, some people still associate HIV with an infectious disease who may not fully understand a concept like U equals U. They may have been afraid to go to the doctor, afraid to take medication for the rest of their lives. And it doesn't look like the goal to every person who is first diagnosed. And it can often, if it's mentioned very early on at that point of diagnosis, can actually not be harmful. And even Bruce Rickman has noted about, for example, women living with HIV. They've helped me understand how language can be stigmatizing and to keep in mind how elevation of the status of undetectable is likely to stigmatize people who experience barriers to getting there. So from a holistic care viewpoint, while it's one of the goals, it may not be the main one. There's housing, there's finances, there's other health conditions, mental health, etc. is all part of holistic care. And it's great as a science and it's great as a tool in the toolkit of care, but it's not the entire toolbox. And messaging is not always reaching communities it wants to be empowering. And it unfortunately can embolden those in the wider community to actually weaponize HIV status while creating a hierarchy within HIV. And I think there's, I talked about viral blips briefly, and maybe this will come as part of the questions around U equals U and around the viral load, the undetectable viral load, the limit that the WHO has put in of 1,000 copies. So it's obviously common for people on antiretroviral medication to experience a viral blip. And the partners study showed there was no transmission of HIV to their partners, so they experienced a viral blip between 20 to 200 copies per mil. And I think that's something we might have to perhaps have a discussion around later. But I think if I come back to women very briefly, movements founded around that sort of leadership that we've had in the HIV epidemic for so long, which just didn't always center on people of color, cisgender women or transgender people. And I think this is one of the reasons why we've got people who are vulnerable and are being left behind, and they're the most affected. There is huge relationship power dynamics for women. It's got huge implications for HIV stigma, and it doesn't erase the generations of unequal treatment and violence against women. And it's part of the reason why the HIV epidemic continues to flourish among women globally. Women cannot demand that their partners often they don't have that ability to negotiate. So they often can't demand their partners use condoms because of uneven power dynamics and even fear of violence. And they may not be able to ask about their partner's treatment status or viral load for similar reasons. Or partners may not honor a woman's request to use condoms or other barriers, but they also may use what they claim to be their undetectable viral load as a reason. So women are often disproportionately affected in this way. And I think more research and insights needed into many ways that partner power dynamics may affect U equals U for women. So in the meantime, access to prevention methods that women themselves control, such as PrEP. And I'd note that in Australia, approximately only 2% of PrEP users are women. The other issue for women is around U equals U when it comes to breast milk and breastfeeding. And whilst the risk does decrease if you're on antiretroviral medication, your viral load's undetectable, there still may be a risk of transmission. So it's actually very confusing for women to make these decisions, and they need to be supported to make those informed decisions. But U equals U doesn't apply to breast milk, and it doesn't always apply for people who are using drugs as well. So there is still some evidence space that needs to be issued around that. And I just wanted to talk to criminalisation. Nathan touched on it, and it is incredibly harmful to public health. But the issue with U equals U around HIV criminalisation is that the mandatory disease testing laws have just served to amplify stigma. And there are issues with the New South Wales Public Health Act and the new consent laws that have implications for people living with HIV, irrespective of U equals U. So treatment as prevention or an undetectable viral load haven't yet been tested legally. Sex with someone on PrEP doesn't currently qualify as a reasonable precaution is the legal liability lies with the person living with HIV. And we really do continue to operate in an area of considerable legal uncertainty. And in HIV, it's consent, not disclosure, that makes the sex lawful. So disclosure of HIV status is generally considered the most reliable way to ensure consent, but then that has issues as well. So has U equals U in the conclusion in the paper been evidence to be a powerful tool for reducing HIV-related stigma and discrimination, including experience of self-stigma among people living with HIV? And I think the U equals U movement sometimes misses the mark on the populations it's aiming to prioritise. People living with HIV can't be responsible for the burden of work in ending the epidemic. We're often placed in positions where we carry that responsibility and accountability for the sexual health of others. And our undetectable status also shouldn't be used as a badge of honour to tell people it's safe to sleep with us or interact with us without fear of contracting HIV. And it's also emboldened the idea that negative status is perfection. And there is, I think, arguably a new kind of class system within the HIV community and a hierarchy of the bodies that society now deems as acceptable or safe. Is U equals U a scientific fact? Yes. Is it important to educate people that when you get to an undetectable viral load, you can no longer transmit the virus? Yes. Should a movement centered on outcome, we scientifically know not everyone can achieve or maintain because of social, economic, and environmental determinants of health? No. U equals U is a part of the toolkit, just like condoms, harm reduction, PrEP, treatment as prevention. It's one of the many tools that should be used, but it should not be sold as the end all and be all. It's unfortunately sold as the only marker for good health, which in itself, of itself, is dangerous. And finally, the remarkable promise of U equals U will not be realised unless structural and material changes are made to ensure access to HIV testing, treatment and care, comprehensive holistic healthcare, and necessary social supports are available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. You've brought a lot of nuance into the conversation there. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker, Bo Justin Xiao, who's the coordinator of Sexualised Drug Use and the PLHIV Leadership Program. Bo Justin has 5 years' experience in community health and is pursuing a postgraduate degree in social work at the University of Sydney. At ACON, he leads peer support and health promotion programs for gay and bisexual men living with HIV. Thank you, Bo Justin, for joining us today.
Thank you, Bridget. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded lands and pay my respect to First Nations elders past, present, and emerging. And thank you, Nathan and Jane. Today, I think what I'll bring to this conversation is 8 years after the U equals U concept was discovered. How do communities perceive this message and whether it's been effective or not? So to do that, I will bring 2 case studies from the peer work we do at ACON. To this panel. So the first person is Dean. Dean's a Aboriginal gay man in his 40s. I first met Dean in a HIV positive people's social event, and we have stayed friends since then. It was one weekend around 11 p.m. Dean called me in a panic and said that he was being accused of spreading AIDS by his last hookup. Dean showed me the chat history by screenshots, and at the beginning, the other person was saying, "You've never told me about your HIV. Legally, you're required to tell me that." And we all know that is not true. What Dean decided to do was actually to Google UBL and send his partner a screenshot of what undetectable meant. The partner was not receptive of this message, claimed that he wasn't on PrEP, and he was really scared and distressed. Dean called me and asked me what he should do. And a few days later, I caught up with Dean in person and I asked him, why did you feel that you were obligated to educate someone, even though you've done the right things as a positive person. And he broke down to tears and said to me, I've worked really hard in my life. I take my medications every day. I'm a good person. I don't know how much more I need to do in order for other people to not see me as a virus. The second case study is from Edward. Edward is an international student from Southeast Asia. Edward was referred to me for chemsex peer support after a GHB overdose. And during intake, I thought it was going to be a very straightforward harm reduction education that's delivered by a peer. But the story was a bit more complicated. Edward has been undetectable for 7 years. And he was first diagnosed in his home country. And when he came to Australia, like the doctors here were put him on the compassionate care plan and got him free treatment. The treatment was much better and much more advanced than what he was receiving in his home country. In his words, he was grateful that Australia could offer that. With the recent shortage of PrEP, one day, Edward was in a chemsex session with a regular partner who he's been having sex with for a couple of years. They've always played condomless, but that night, because his partner couldn't find PrEP, he decided to put condoms on. Edward, although not said anything, he felt the stigma of being a positive person that's infectious to others just came back. He didn't want to deal with the shame and the guilt and the feelings of being inherently unacceptable by others. So he took more GHB than what he would normally does and ended up in an overdose. When I spoke to Edward, I asked him, what did U equals U mean to you? He said, all I know is the doctors told me that I'm a virus that's no longer infectious. However, I don't know if my partner needs to be on PrEP or not. And I think from both cases, what we see is the medical science part of the message is delivered really well by clinicians, but sometimes doctors either don't feel comfortable enough or don't have enough time to talk about how does this work in practice, can lead to problem. Both Dean and Edward did not have the confidence and the belief to be their self-advocate when they encountered stigmatized behavior, and that resulted in poor mental health, in certain cases, drug overdose, and long-term low self-esteem. So I'm aware of time, and I know we have a short Q&A afterwards, but 8 years after the U equals U concept was discovered, to certain communities, this message has not been delivered that well, and definitely not to its greatest potential. And as a positive person myself, I know that U equals U isn't just a medical term, but it can bring an opportunity for someone reinvent their self-image. And I'm looking forward to more opportunities to do that through peer work and discussions like this. But that's from me for now.
Thank you so much, Bo Justin. Thank you to all of our presenters for a really, really rich and an interesting conversation. I wanted to ask a question about one of the themes that has been running through this is how certain populations are being able to benefit more from the U equals U message, either because of the way that it has been presented to them or because of the way that they have been able to receive it in their lives and take it up. I wondered about the role of medical paternalism, as in, do you think that some clinicians are less willing to talk to people about them not having the capacity or being unable to transmit because of judgments that they're making about the particular person? Is that something that, and I'm open for anybody to answer that question. So feel free. If Bo Justin, do go ahead. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I might jump in because one thing from working with both of those gay men I mentioned earlier was it's not just the stigma work, the HIV stigma work that I needed to work with them. It's also this whole reinvention of their identity. So in both cases, there's religious beliefs, there's cultural values, and certain communities are also not on the same page as, I guess, Western gay liberation. Like certain communities still carry stigma about being a gay man. So for them to start believing the message of U equals U, very often we need to encourage community to understand what does being a gay man even mean, and how do we build confidence for them, so they can be more perceptive of the message of U equals U, and often that needs to come from so many different aspects. Like you need friends that are supportive, you need clinicians that really care about you, and then you need to see real examples in real life so that they know next time what to do themselves.
Another really major theme that's come out today, and I think each of you has mentioned this, is that the language itself is not particularly accessible. And you have talked about this idea of you can't pass it on as being potentially a better message. What are your thoughts about what would it take for health promotion to focus more on you can't pass it on, rather than this kind of this internationally received term U equals U that we've been working with? Do you have thoughts about this, Jane?
Look, I think as people living with HIV, we very much had treatment as prevention for a long time, as I mentioned, and that is effectively U equals U. Treatment is prevention. So that's almost slightly more understandable, and definitely can't pass it on. I know I've spoken with a number of people in Aboriginal communities who just said can't pass it on is a much easier concept. And I don't necessarily think it means that you're changing U equals U, and I think it's a very good message, but I think we have to understand that we need much more targeted and nuanced approaches around language, and that just like, if we're going to sort of actually end HIV transmission by 2030, we need to be thinking of nuanced and targeted ways to approach other populations. So we need to think about this in the context of U equals U as well, and find things that work for people, and not accept that just one message is one size is going to fit all, because it doesn't, and we know that just simply from the epidemic itself.
And I think as well, it's who is targeted as well. Like who are we aiming that language at? Because I was thinking when Bo Justin was talking, in the case study where the partner had run out of PrEP and so wanted to use condoms, which I think there's a conversation in there somewhere about how, for years we've been saying take personal responsibility as well. You make sure you're protected, and then you don't have to worry about the person you're having sex with. But obviously, if you've lived with the stigma of HIV for so long, then things like that, it makes sense that they'd sort of be taken personally, or that they can't be trusted, but I was sort of thinking a lot of it seems to be that the onus is on the person living with HIV to be educating other people. So yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but sort of we can't just be targeting people living with HIV for this messaging.
It's a really interesting thing that runs across this particular element, in the prevention toolkit, is the fact that there is a potential, I guess, for the workload to disproportionately fall on people living with HIV, and obviously that's something that we have to work against. Like we want the good parts of U equals U, the kind of liberation that can create, without the negative aspect of it increasing burdens and making it seem that it is the responsibility, because it can't be the responsibility of every person living with HIV to be undetectable, because it is not possible. And therefore it's the responsibility of the culture to be able to accept that that it's an excellent thing and it's attainable by some people and it's not attainable by everybody, and prevention cultures need to be able to kind of hold that and work with that. Jane, you talked about this, about people for whom getting to undetectable might not be possible. What are people saying about that?
I think it creates an additional layer of stigma, Bridget. It's because the messaging out there is this is the sort of gold standard, that somehow if you aren't able to achieve an undetectable viral load, that you've somehow failed, or there's something wrong, or you're not doing the right thing. And I think that can be quite damaging for people. And I think we just need to acknowledge that this is going to be the case. And this is why I think I talked more about it should be more about a holistic standard of health, not just simply attaining an undetectable viral load as being the thing to do. It needs to be much more comprehensive than that, and take into account, people who've been living longer term with HIV have a lot of multi-morbidities, and there is these issues around quality of life. And I think this is what's important. It's not just simply around that, but we have to be really careful about not stigmatizing people who can't, for whatever reason and through no fault of their own, actually achieve an undetectable viral load, because that would be harmful.
Thank you, Jane. I think we've got time to answer one of the questions that we have from online. And this is from Philip Keane, who's thanking you all for fantastic presentations. Bo Justin, I might throw this to you. Do you know any examples of where U=U has been well communicated or accepted in some of the population, in some of the subpopulations that we're recognising as having, a higher barrier possibly to being able to make this operational?
Yeah, I think when people feel connected to communities, they are more likely to stick with the message, the science, because they've seen other people's success. It's always easier to, follow the footsteps of someone who's already done it, instead of like thinking you are the only person in this entire world that needs to do it.
Great, thank you. In that case, we do actually have time to address our second question, which is from Karen Drysdale. And she's asking, similar to what Nathanael was saying, is how do you create socially resonant messaging that removes that sense of the sole responsibility? Jane, are you able to think about how we might be able to do that in prevention culture? How do you think that might look?
I think we need to posit people living with HIV as being the answer, not the problem. We're constantly the problem, the issue, and we're perceived as vectors of disease, when in fact most people living with HIV, I think we're now up to sort of 98% of people living with HIV in New South Wales have an undetectable viral load. So there needs to be this onus, or something needs to change around. And I think it's around responsibility. And I think this comes down to some of the criminalisation legislation as well. I think there is, in terms to answer Karen's message around messaging, I think there needs to be a broader idea promoted around health and well-being, and that this is joint responsibility. And in sexual health, it's very much a joint responsibility. It's not just the, as I said before, the onus on one person. And that's the person living with HIV. It is actually, it's the people who don't know their status that potentially are contributing to HIV transmission. It's not people living with HIV. So maybe we need to think of a more positive way to actually posit that, so that can be seen as, if you know your status and you're on medication and you have an undetectable viral load, that is actually a good thing.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely note to finish on. I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking our three wonderful presenters today. You've given us lots of food for thought. Thank you for presenting today at the Kirby Institute seminar.